What's up, guys? Welcome to Daily Dose of Reddit. This is your host with a bird on his shoulder. Seriously, Zach, and today's subreddit is r/ProRevenge. And it's a little cockatiel I named Miss Honey because she's sweet and she's pretty. Alright, this story's called Landlord Tries to Rip Me Off for £400, ends up having to pay me over £6,500. Last year, I moved out of a house that I had rented for 5 years with no problems. I always had a good relationship with the landlord. There are two relevant bits of background to this story. In the UK, where I live, the standard practice when renting a house is to sign a tenancy agreement for a year. At the end of the year, if you want to stay in the house and the landlord is happy with that, you can just do nothing and the tenancy will continue automatically until either the tenant or the landlord gives notice. Alternatively, you can sign a new one-year tenancy agreement each year, which isn't really necessary, but some landlords want it. My new landlord wanted me to sign a new tenancy agreement each year. Fine, whatever. So since I rented the house for 5 years, there were 5 tenancy agreements in total. 2. By law, the landlord was required to protect my security deposit. That meant she had to put it into a special kind of account within 30 days of receiving it. The tenant then receives login details for the account so they can check that it's protected and view various info about it. One point of doing this is so that the deposit is held by an independent party who can mediate if the landlord and tenant disagree about any deductions. There is a dispute process that the tenant can request and which is free for the tenant to use. So, I'd been living in the house for almost 5 years and I gave notice to end the tenancy because I was buying a house. After I'd given notice, the landlord emailed me to ask if I was planning to hire a gardener to ensure that the garden would be returned to the pretty manicured state it was when I moved in. I thought this was strange because my tenancy agreement explicitly forbade me from doing the sorts of things in the garden that would have been necessary to maintain its original state. Exempli Gracia, it said that I was not allowed to lop any shrubs or bushes. So all I'd been doing is cutting the grass and the hedge. Basically, that clause looked like something that a landlord would include if they planned to maintain the garden themselves. Except she didn't maintain it while I was living there. In retrospect, it seems that she didn't read her own tenancy agreement properly. I replied to the landlord's email about the garden. I quoted the part of the tenancy agreement that forbade me from doing certain things in the garden and expressed my confusion. I asked her to clarify what her expectations were about the state of the garden, given what it said in the tenancy agreement. She didn't reply, but a couple of weeks later, I received an email from her husband or boyfriend telling me that the landlord was anxious about the garden and I should ensure that it is returned to the same state as at the start of the tenancy. I replied to him and again asked for clarification given the wording of the tenancy agreement. He replied saying that he'd have the landlord get back to me herself, which she never did. Without any guidance about the garden, I just did my best with it. My boyfriend, who is an experienced gardener, did the work here. I asked him just to do whatever he thought was best. He cut back bushes and cleared loads of stuff. I spent a few £100 on having the garden waste removed. I knew that technically I did not need to do that, but wanted to do what I could to keep relations good between me and the landlord. I moved out, the tenancy ended, and after not hearing anything from the landlord for a couple of weeks and not having my deposit back, I emailed the landlord to ask about the deposit. Having ignored my queries about the garden before the end of the tenancy, she chose this moment to announce that she wanted to deduct £400 from my deposit to carry out work on the garden. There followed a really time-wasting back and forth by email in which I pointed out that the terms of the tenancy agreement were incompatible with my being able to maintain the original state of the garden, and she just kept repeating that the garden was not returned to her in its original state. In the end, I suggested suggested that since we couldn't agree about deductions from my deposit, we should use the independent dispute process offered by the company that was holding the deposit. That process needs to be kicked off by the landlord, so I asked her to authorize it. She didn't do that. Instead, she kept wasting my time by sending me emails trying to negotiate an amount to put the garden right, which I wasn't gonna entertain. Meanwhile, I could not log into the account where my deposit was being held. I contacted the company, and it turned out that my landlord had accidentally input my email address incorrectly when registering the deposit, which I found very strange because she had emailed me successfully dozens of times throughout the time I was living in the house, so she definitely knew my email address. Without being able to log in, I was unable to officially dispute any deduction she was proposing. There is a window of 3 months after the end of tenancy when you can dispute any deductions. After that, you either take what the landlord is willing to return or go to court, according to Justice for Tenants, who I contacted for advice. It's relatively common for unscrupulous landlords to register their tenants' details incorrectly in an attempt to make it harder for them to recover the deposits in the time frame available for disputes. I had a long back and forth with the deposit company, after which I finally gained access to my deposit account. When I got into it, I looked at the info and noticed that the landlord had not protected my deposit until the day after I gave her notice to end the tenancy. That meant she protected my deposit well after the 30-day deadline by which she was supposed to do it by law. There are penalties for landlords that fail to comply with the laws around tenancy deposits. If they break the rules and the tenant takes them to court, they have to return the full deposit plus between 1 and 3 times the amount of the deposit as compensation. Also, they are not allowed to make any deductions from a tenant's deposit if they haven't complied with the law. I emailed the landlady a bit more firmly than I had previously. Things had been cordial but increasingly frosty. I pointed out that she could not make any deductions from my deposit because she had not complied with the law. She responded by sending me quite a tantrumy, insulting email and authorizing the return of my full deposit. So yay for the deposit back, but what a freaking mean woman for insulting me when I hadn't done anything wrong. I was pissed off by the fact that she tried to rip me off and wasted hours and hours of my time trying to sort this out. Not to mention my stress. Just seeing an email from her land in my inbox caused my stomach to flip by this point. This is when things started to get a bit more exciting. As I said above, landlords who don't comply with the law around tenancy deposits have to pay between 1 and 3 times the value of the deposit in compensation, plus return the full deposit if they get taken to court. The documentation from the tenancy deposit scheme proved that she had broken the law. I had already had my deposit back, but it was clear that if I took her to court, I would receive a minimum of that amount again. Except, of course, I didn't have just the one tenancy agreement with her. As I already mentioned, she had insisted on my signing a new tenancy agreement every year, so I'd had 5 tenancy agreements in total. I spent a few hours checking the law and going through old emails and documentation, and it turned out that she had failed to protect my deposit correctly in all of the 5 tenancies I'd had with her. I had a ton of documentation to prove that. That meant that if I took her to court, I stood to receive a minimum of not 1 but 5 times the amount of my original deposit, over £6,500. It would cost me a couple of £100 to take her to court, and I was 100% willing to do that. In fact, at this point, I was relishing that prospect. In order to take her to court, I first had to send her a letter before action in which I set out my complaint against her and gave her an opportunity to make an offer to avoid going to court. I had a barrister friend who was helping me out at this point with advice for free. The landlord replied to my letter quite dismissively, basically saying that it was clearly just an admin error that caused her to fail to protect my deposit correctly every year for 5 years. and accusing me of being motivated by a windfall. I replied by email correcting her various mistaken assumptions and repeating the need for her to make an offer in order to avoid court. After a while, she replied and offered me £4,000. I told her that the minimum I would accept was a little over $6,500. I forget the exact figure, since that was the minimum I would stand to get in court. She agreed with certain conditions attached, perhaps conditions that she thought I might not be able to fulfill. Things like sending her copies of all the documentation relating to the deposit for previous year's tenancies, but which I was able to do immediately. When the money landed in my bank account, I emailed her to explain that I would have dropped my complaint against her immediately had she at any point offered a sincere apology, which was true, at least up until that final email where she insulted me. I also said that I hope she would deal more fairly and reasonably with future tenants. She didn't reply. I hope that I will never again be a tenant, but having spent many years being richarded around by poopy landlords and letting agents, it was a satisfying end to my renting days with such a satisfying and profitable middle finger. Hey, that's actually pretty good. I wasn't expecting her to own up and pay you what you were owed. I thought you had to take her to court, but good thing you didn't, because court fees, they suck. This story's called Fiancé Left Me Due to My Cancer Diagnosis. I Left Her Destitute. This has been 4 years ago, so the sting is gone and my revenge has been had. Sorry if this isn't the right forum. We dated for 4 years and had what I thought was a great relationship. We were both well-established professionals who both owned homes in the same neighborhood and both with daughters in the home. Her daughter was 11, mine was 16 when we met. We had actually planned to get married, build a house, and raise the two together. We planned the house build because she had recently been diagnosed with a neurological disease that would eventually put her in a wheelchair and need something ADA friendly. During the planning stages, I began doing landscape and construction projects on her home to increase the resale value. All in, I invested roughly $30,000 into the home, running everything through my side construction business for tax, permitting, and resale purposes. We had a contract that payment would be made upon sale of the home. I produced invoices for each and every project, but never pushed for payment because of the prior agreement. Fast forward 6 months. We're looking at property to develop and finalizing drawings on the home when I began feeling ill. I couldn't eat, constantly vomiting and passing blood. I began noticing that my abdomen looked swollen, which was odd because we were both very clean eaters and were in the gym every day. So I went to the doctors and began having tests done. During this time, she began having small cognitive issues, and the stress of her current position was exacerbating her condition. So she took a $20,000 per annum cut in pay along with a lesser position inside the company. After a month or so of different tests and a biopsy, it came back that I had a golf ball-sized tumor in my stomach and would need to begin chemotherapy. So I began chemo and radiation treatments, which made me, expectedly so, extremely ill. She was spending time helping around my place on the weekends and staying over more, to the point that they were both at my home more than theirs. At this point, I suggested that we go ahead and put one of our houses on the market and move in together until the new house was built. I have great supplemental insurance as well as a long-term illness plan, so using that coupled with the sale of one of our houses would push us through comfortably and help ease the financial stress on her. Shortly after this discussion, she became extremely distant. Her daughter wasn't coming down and hanging out with mine anymore. She had excuses for not getting together. She quit driving me to treatments and stopped staying over. She then dropped a bomb. a sentence that will forever be burned into my psyche. I love you, but I can't see myself taking care of someone this sick in the long term, and I don't think we should see each other any longer. In a text. It broke me. I won't lie. This was the first woman I had ever opened up to and planned a life with since my wife died when my children were 1 and 3. I tried to be mature about it. I forced myself to understand her position and to accept what I could not change. I calmly, the next day, gathered all of her things, packed them neatly, loaded them in my truck, and took them to her house to leave on the back porch while she was at work, in order to avoid any awkward exchanges. Walking around the back and under the porch, I sat down a box and saw her in her back living room, on the couch, having sex with a man that she had introduced to me as a lifelong friend. I had dinner and drinks with this man and his girlfriend. We had gone on vacation with them as well. I never spoke of the incident with her and simply sent her a text later explaining that I would leave her things on my side porch to pick up at her convenience. I discovered 8 or 9 months later from his now ex-girlfriend that they had broken up due to him confessing that he had been sleeping with my significant other, dating back to about the time we were finishing drawings on the new home. Now I'm pissed. Revenge time. At this point, I had finished chemo and radiation for the time being and was feeling healthier. I was going through some much neglected paperwork when I ran across the file that contained $32,680 in unpaid, long overdue invoices, which were promptly sent to my attorney to begin lien proceedings on the home. It turns out that I couldn't have done this a moment too soon because she was set to put her house on the market. Coupled with interest over the course of what was then 19 months overdue, the invoices were hefty. That, along with the agreements of settling them when the house was sold and attorney fees, left her with roughly $10,000 after the sale of the home and settling her current mortgage. She promptly had to back out of the purchase of another home and moved in with her oldest daughter, sister-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. She also had to leave her job and begin receiving disability. I ran into her a little over a year ago, and she looked as if she had aged 20 years and was in the wheelchair we had talked about. We chatted cordially but briefly, and I excused myself and went on with my day. A few days later, her daughter called me and spoke of my running into her mom, and could we hang out sometime? I gave a vague answer, thanked her for calling, and again went on with my day. The ex then called me a week or so later and began apologizing me for leaving me as she did. Again, cordial, but short. I thanked her for calling and hung up. She began texting, and this went on for several weeks until one day she asked if I could ever see us rekindling what we had. To which I replied, I can't see myself taking care of someone so sick in the long term. Remember the box on your back porch? Did you think that lifelong friend brought that over to you from my house? Good luck to you. Goodbye. I sometimes feel guilt over this, but not much, and not often. You know what? Honestly, the only thing I could say that the OP here did kinda wrong was, not hanging out with her daughter, but he doesn't really have any obligation toward her. But I figured it'd be a nice thing to do. Don't punish the child for the sins of the parent, or however that phrase goes, saying whatever the hell you want to call it. But solid revenge. See, you guys both went through difficult times, more or less taking care of each other, and you stood by her, she didn't. And that must have been rough at the time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss an episode.